session. Well, welcome to workshop 2 in room 2 on Thursday afternoon. We've got the Reverend Professor Sandra Eldridge with us for this session. And we're looking at, does theology have anything to say about reimagining our communities? So if you were in the previous session, we were also talking about imagination. So it's going to be excellent to have another speaker help us think about what it means to reimagine the possibilities. Sandra is a professor in, looking quickly, in biostatistics, or has been, and is now also ordained, and really committed and involved in climate movement. And so we're looking forward to hearing what you've got to share with us. I'm going to hand over to you now. Hopefully we'll have time for questions, as we say, but put thoughts in the chat. And over to Sandra.
Thank you very much, Pippa. So I want to, first of all, just thank the Hazelnut community for allowing me the space to share with you today and say just how much I've enjoyed and learnt over the past couple of days. So I've had a lifelong concern for finding a more sustainable way of living since I read E.F. Schumacher's book, Small is Beautiful, as a teenager. And when I left university in 1979, I wanted to work in an area which would enable me to do that, specifically on renewable energy. But life took me in another direction. And as Pippa said, I ended up being an academic, recently got ordained in the Church of England. And in 2019, while I was training as a curate, a couple of events convinced me that I needed to get more involved in the church's response to the climate emergency. So I started to do that alongside my academic role in the university. And part of that work included running a course in 2021, developed by Hope for the Future, great organisation, to support churches to get involved in political campaigning around COP26, while at the same time progressing on the road of becoming an eco-church. So the course that Hope for the Future developed focused on practical action, but as the sessions progressed, we got feedback from the participants, and we identified from that some of them felt there was a sort of gap in their own thinking or in the responses of their churches in relation to the relationship between theology and the climate emergency. They knew what they wanted to do, campaign around COP26. We were trying to help them in how to do that, but they still felt, I mean, although they had a sort of unspoken sort of articulation inside them of why they wanted to do that, they still felt that they found it hard to articulate why to people around them. So we offered an additional discussion session lasting 2 hours to talk about theology. So what I want to do today is to share with you the material that we used in that session. I'm pretty sure that there are others here who would be more knowledgeable about everything I'm going to be talking about, but the material isn't meant to be comprehensive. It's designed to generate thought and reflection and discussion, and to help in some way with navigating it through the time that we find ourselves in. So I'm going to be skipping over some of the slides because obviously we don't have as much time as we did when I first presented it. And also I'm going to be skipping over some of the discussion points, but I hope that you're going to get a flavour of both the content and the method. Most of the material I'm using is quotes from other people, so obviously you're completely free to use those, but also feel free to use or adapt anything else that I'm going to use in the presentation. So I'm just going to share my screen. So can everybody see that? Yes, good. So this is the first quote. We started really at the beginning with thinking about what theology is about. And I love this quote from Sally McFaig, that theology is the attempt to think about God and the world, who God is and who we are, in the light of what the tradition has claimed in the past and what we must say in the present. And then she goes on to say, every Christian is a theologian, each of us has a theology. And I love that idea. I mean, it's an alien idea for many people. For many people, theology is a bit like going to the dentist. You know, something that's done to you. It's not something that you do, and it's not all that pleasant. But you know, it gives you nice shiny teeth at the end. But I really passionately believe that all of us can think about God, the world, and who we are, and therefore we are all theologians. But the next quote picks up something which is, I never know whether I've covered the screen with the slides, whether you can see them, or whether it's just me that can't see what I've actually written on the slides. Anyway, the next quote is something that I picked off the internet. I'm not quite sure what the source is, but in most theological colleges now, people are taught about this idea of contextual theology, which is Sally McFaig on the last slide sort of said in a similar way, is a way of doing theology that takes seriously both the experience of the past and the experience of the present, where the past is about divine revelation in scriptures and the tradition of Christian people, and the present is the context in which we live and work and minister. And somehow to do theology, we have to put those two things together. Of course, our context may be on a micro scale, this place, this time, these people that we're actually ministering to, but I don't think you'd be here this afternoon if you didn't recognize that there's, for us, for our generation, a much wider context of the climate emergency, which is very specific and applicable across the world. And so the question is, if we're all going to be theologians, how do we do theology? And oh gosh, sorry, my screen is frozen. Let's try something else. There we are. Okay, good. While I think this is a helpful picture which comes from the Church of England about theology coming from different sources. So we can get our theology from scripture, we can get our theology from the tradition of the church, and we can get our theology from reason, and that's often described as a three-legged stool, each of those things representing one of the legs. But more recently, it's been recognized that maybe that's a four-legged stool, and you know, people have added other legs for other things, but actually experience is also a legitimate way of picking up our theology. So to give a chance to reflect on the ideas that I've shown you, in the original session that we ran, we asked this question: what has influenced your thinking about climate change? Just for people to put down anything. It might be scripture, it might be an experience they've had, anything at all that has influenced what you think about climate change. So what I'm going to do today is to ask you to just think about that question and put some thoughts in the chat. It could be more than one thought. It'd be great if everybody could have more than one thought. And I'm going to carry on talking for a little while, and then I'll come back and see what we've got in the chat. So I've already said one of my answers to that question was reading E.F. Schumacher's book in the 1970s. And recognizing simply on the basis of logic that the planet is finite, and humanity, therefore, if it's going to continue successfully, has to live with that recognition. But here's a list of other things that have affected my thinking on the climate emergency. So a renewed understanding of what gift means. I'm going to go through these quite quickly. A recognition of the importance of gratitude, how much the Bible talks about land and greed, and we heard about some of that from Nestor earlier on, if you were in his talk, and we just gloss over that, and also what some theologians are now saying about our current predicament. So I'm just going to have a look in the chat and see. So Pippa has put in the chat, Pope Francis, Greta Thunberg, IPCC reports. So Pope Francis and Greta Thunberg are individuals. IPCC report is put together by a whole load of people. It's not necessarily from a Christian perspective, but it's about the context in which we're living in. Thank you, Nikki. Reading the news, faith-based organizations talking about the effects of climate change. And then Heather, the BBC News, Diane, joining our local transition town 16 years ago. And I think just that small sort of list of things in the chat already, and please do keep those coming, you can see that actually where we're getting our thinking about climate change from is a variety of sources. I have a friend who listened to Rowan Williams talk about climate change, and then she said she wept for a month. I mean, not continuously, obviously, but on and off for a month because of what he'd said. And so there are, and that was an experience for her. So there are many, many different ways in which we can gather the information that we hold about what we think about climate emergency. Walter Brueggemann and Ellen Davis, lovely, Kate. So I don't think I'm going to be talking specifically about Walter Brueggemann, though he is one of my favorite theologians, but I am going to be quoting something from Ellen Davis in a minute. So one of the things that sort of list on the chat sort of highlights is that, you know, we come at this from different angles, different perspectives. And that's great because it can build a real richness in our thinking. But sometimes differences can be challenging. So the other thing that we looked at in the original workshop where we discussed this was a whole list of things, and you'll recognize in this list, these are things that are connected to our Christian belief. And there are probably things that you would want to add that I've missed off. Again, it's not meant to be complete, but just to get us thinking about things, and to not all Christian traditions will have the same emphasis on these things listed here. So just to give you an example, the reason why I put justice up there is I know personally I am a person who's driven by justice or injustice, probably, rather than justice. That's what drives me, and that's what drives a lot of my campaigning around the climate emergency, but also other things. But actually, I come from a church tradition where the atonement is quite central. And what that does sometimes, it creates this kind of barrier where it's very difficult to communicate and to understand across that divide what I'm saying to people and what they're saying back to me. And I think sometimes simply identifying those kind of gaps and challenges can be helpful in fostering understanding and thinking about how we frame conversations that might lead to reimagining. So you may want to think about these questions later. I'm not going to suggest we put answers to those in the chat as well, but you may want to. Where does your tradition place the emphasis here? Where do your church leaders place the emphasis? And where do you place the emphasis? Because that sometimes helps in understanding how to have the conversations. And that's something that the people who we originally did this course with were struggling with. So I want to move on now and talk a little bit about our context, and that's what the rest of the slides are really on, just focusing on our context. We're the first generation to recognise en masse how human behaviour is affecting our world. We're living with a future possibility of human extinction. In wealthy countries, we're probably recognising something that we've tried to bury for many decades, that we are actually vulnerable. And in that new context, what happens to our theology? So this is the Ellen Davis quote. What she says in her book, Scripture, Culture and Agriculture, was Ezekiel was the only biblical writer to reinterpret virtually the whole religious tradition up to his time. And significantly for us, he did it in a situation of unprecedented disaster. So that presents to us the idea that theology can evolve, and that's been captured by other theologians. So Archbishop Fabo Magobi of South Africa compared the climate emergency with the situation of the South African Christians coming out of apartheid and realizing that, contrary to their expectations, they were not walking into a new utopia, and therefore they needed a renewed theology in their context. And this is another quote by David Brown, another theologian that I really enjoy reading, and he's not talking about the climate emergency at all, and yet he makes this point that we can reinterpret what we read in new ways, in new contexts. And I've really enjoyed a lot of the past 2 days, as I said, and yesterday listened to David Blower talking about the Psalms. And I love the title that he gave to his session about recovering the Psalms. And when our theology evolves, what we're almost always doing is to recover, rediscover, renew, and reinterpret. And David talked in that session about seeing things he'd not seen before, because now he's looking with the awareness of our current context. So I'm sure we've all had instances of looking at the physical objects and not being able to see something until we look more closely, or until somebody points out something to us. And in a way, I think our theology evolves when we hear the voice of God kind of whispering in our ears, look again, just look again, there are other things to see. But I think this raises a question in the minds of some, and that question is, when is reinterpretation valid, and how and who should do this? So we don't have time to discuss that, but if you want to put any thoughts or questions in the chat, please do. So the rest of the slides are really about some of those points that I listed on the earlier slide about the different aspects of our Christian belief. And I'm only really going to go through 2, and I'm going to go through them quite quickly. But the first one, I think, is really quite important, and obviously it's creation. And probably most people on the call will recognize this quote from Rowan Williams: our present ecological crisis, the biggest single threat to our human existence in the middle to long term, has, religious people would say, a great deal to do with our failure to think of the world as existing in relation to the mystery of God, not just a huge warehouse of stuff to be used for our convenience. And I love that. If we're talking about imagination, I love that thing about thinking of the world as existing in relation to the mystery of God. Other theologians have expressed something similar. So Wendell, calling you Wendy. Wendell Berry, talking about the American way of life being a thoughtless, heartless, greedy plunge into what apparently is still considered an inexhaustible supply. And then the Pope and Mark mentioned some of this earlier, talking about when nature is viewed solely as a source of profit and gain, this has serious consequences for society. And yet nature has been viewed as a source of profit and gain. It has been viewed as an inexhaustible supply, and it has been viewed as a huge warehouse of stuff to be used for our convenience. And the voices that tell us all that shout very loudly, and they can leave us feeling both bewildered and disempowered. So looking back, that's how I felt in 1979, when in response to a question in an interview with the Central Electricity Generating Board, where I said I only wanted to work on renewable energy, I was told, are you a member of Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, or CND? Because if you are, we don't want you. And that kind of response would be unthinkable today, but the culture of infinite economic growth is still with us, and I think it's quite strong. And it has an insidious hold on us, and it may be something we want to consciously address in trying to reimagine faith communities. So because of limited time, I'm going to fast forward, and apologies if these are areas that you really want to discuss. I'm going to fast forward through incarnation. I'm going to fast forward through atonement, though I would really love to talk about this because I've got a personal story to tell on that one. I'm going to fast forward through eschatology, and I'm going to go to hope, partly because that's another one where I think we may want to have a little bit of discussion. So we included hope specifically in our original workshop because somebody had asked whether we could do so, and her question was, how do I have hope in the current context? And it's a question that many theologians have actually asked, and in 2013 there was a special issue in the Anvil Journal about this, to which Richard Borkham contributed, and this is a quote from his paper where he makes this distinction between something he calls ultimate hope, which is about what God's going to do, fulfilling his purposes for his creation ultimately. And then proximate hopes are those which are much nearer, sort of in the immediate future. And the ultimate hope is something that obviously is up to God, but the proximate hope depends partly on what humans do. And much more recently, Timothy Robinson has written about how if we're really going to have a proper Christian hope, we have to embrace hopelessness. And what I think is interesting about these two quotes is they come from quite different perspectives, but in the end, they end up in the same place. That Richard says proximate hopes depend partly on what humans do. He's talking about human activity and the importance of that. And Timothy Robinson is talking about the way beyond despair, that we need to seek wisdom to live more humanly. So that somehow the actions that we take are connected to hope. Through those actions, we may discover hope. So in an effort to do a bit more theology in real time, I wanted to ask the question, what gives you hope? So I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen, if that's okay, Pippa. And if we've got enough time, just ask people to speak about this rather than put it in the chat. What gives you hope? I don't know whether anybody just wants to unmute themselves and just share that with us.
So what gives me hope is little local things that are working for change in communities. Not necessarily many people, but there's quite lots of it happening, so it adds up. Yeah, great. It's sometimes the little things that we see, there's little signs of hope and growth. Jo, you're also unmuted.
Oh, I think it's young people's response. That really reminds me of that sense of justice that you were talking about, or injustice we were talking about earlier. Well, yes, what are we doing? I mean, obviously Greta Thunberg is the voice of that, but they've all got it. You've only got to talk to a 4-year-old about, what we're doing to our planet, and really inspiring.
I completely
and the kind of sense of responsibility that we have to then work with them.
Young people absolutely are an inspiration. So Nikki's unmuted, and then also Pippa.
I would echo the small things locally. I find hope from being engaged with Operation Noah, where I'm involved as a trustee, but also my local church, which has really got on board with creation care as being part of the Christian ethos, and we've actually become a gold eco church. But we do an annual lifestyle survey where we get as many people as possible to just answer some questions about what changes they've made in response to the message. And that goes out not just to members of the congregation, but also to people who use the church during the week. And it can be really encouraging to see that people are taking those steps to react and to change elements of their lifestyle in line with being much more climate friendly.
That sounds great. An annual lifestyle survey. I think that sounds like a brilliant idea. Pippa.
Well, I do think people are talking about it more. It gives me hope that this is a much more live conversation about creation care for the environment, how we are living, and that gives me hope. And that people are experimenting with different ways of living, and I'm seeing that more and more. People are trying to live lighter to the earth. And that is encouraging and hopeful. It's not all doom and gloom. And things like the Earth Prize earlier in the year, where you're starting to see some of these projects overseas, all across the earth, really trying to tackle things in creative ways. We've got to take hold of those things and really hold on to them and not just live. You kind of have to do that living, understand the despair and hopelessness and be okay being there, but also kind of live in the hope. And we do this a lot, I think. And really important to hold on to both.
Absolutely, it's a kind of balance. Pippa, I don't want to go on past my time, so I've got two.
Yeah, we've hit 5:25, and thank you for another really stimulating session. It's been really good to get that theological overview and thinking kind of big about hope and reimagining and theology. So thank you, everybody. Thank you so much, Sandra, for your time, and I'm sure people can kind of find you and follow up and get the slides and things like that, and this will be on the website before too long as well.
Great.
We now have another 5-minute break before workshop 3 for those of you who've got the stamina to keep going. There'll be another workshop with me this time in 5 minutes in this room. So thank you so much. Thanks, Sandra. That was great.
Thank you.
I'm going to stop recording.
Okay.
I can find it. There we go.